Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really happy to have with me once again James Perloff. James joins me on the first Tuesday of each month to discuss a couple of chapters at a time of his book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Well, 2 months ago, we discussed the first 2 chapters of his book, and that dealt with the past 6 major American wars, and we discussed how false flags were clandestinely created to rally the American people behind those wars, and that helped to empower an elite class of Americans at the expense of most other Americans, though few Americans seem to recognize that they don't really have too much to say in their government anymore. Nonetheless, James has helped us to understand that reality in his book that we're talking about here today. Last month, we touched a little bit on chapters 3 and 4 of Truth is a Lonely Warrior, but didn't really do justice to those 2 chapters, which are extremely important, I believe, in understanding why policies that are ruining America continue to be employed. In spite of the fact that they're unsuccessful, they're continually being employed, those policies, whether you're talking about economics or foreign policy. So we're back here again today to revisit the content of chapters 3 and 4 of the book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Chapter 3 is titled The Devil as Banker, and Chapter 4 is titled How the Cartel Has Run America. So let's jump right into our discussion with James Perloff. Welcome back, James. Thanks for joining me again.
Jay, thank you for having me back on.
Really good to talk to you. Always refreshing to talk to someone who is really working hard to find out what's really going on as opposed to the propaganda that we're fed day in and day out. I should mention before we get started to our listeners, I should mention that they can read James' bio on my page at the Voice America website. You can learn more about all that James is up to as well by going to jamesperloff.com. You can also very easily order his book through that website, James Perloff. That's Perloff, jamesperloff.com. James, in the first 2 chapters of your book, you discuss the past 6 wars in which the American people were essentially tricked into supporting those wars, both in terms of treasury and blood. Americans were tricked by false flags orchestrated not for the good of America, but for the selfish interest of an elite and powerful group of corporate and banking interests who were invisible, at least in terms of their controlling America's presidential candidates, essentially. And who essentially seem to be puppets to this sort of silent ruling class. The 6 wars that we discussed were the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Iraqi War. And I would just like to say to our listeners out there, if there are those of you who doubt the false flags idea, I would encourage you to listen to our show that we conducted with James back in March at Voice America, to listen to what he has to say about that, and even better yet, order the book Truth is a Lonely Warrior, because James does a very good job of footnoting. He's not just making allegations. He's not making allegations. He is not saying anything until he has something to back it up with. So if you read his book, I think you certainly will do yourself a favor if you're interested in finding out the truth. Well, let's get right into chapters 3 and 4, which is the topic of this month. The Industrial Revolution began in earnest in the United States following our Civil War, and President Lincoln became very concerned, even at that time, about the rising power of corporations in America. Way back then, our president voiced concerns about how an elite group of corporate leaders could, and he believed would, eventually destroy our republic. So I'd like to just take a second here to read this quote from Abraham Lincoln, dated November 21st, 1864. Quoting our former president, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic destroyed." End of quote, Abraham Lincoln, November 21st, 1864. So, James, with the Industrial Revolution in America following the Civil War, there evolved some extremely wealthy families who began to work against the interest of America and our Constitution that was designed really to help Americans enjoy the rights that were given to us not by government, but in fact by our Creator. James, can you tell us who were some of those wealthy American and foreign families that began the destruction of our Constitution and have led us to where our country is today?
Certainly. Well, as you were reading that quote, I was just remarking to myself how prophetic Lincoln was in that statement. But as far as who they were, I'm going to give a quote which I hate to be redundant because I gave this quote before, but I think it sheds so much light concisely on the situation. It's from Ferdinand Lundberg in his landmark book, America's 60 Families. Now, this was published in 1937, and Lundberg wrote for the Wall Street Journal and many other financial publications, and he traced really through the financial records who owned America. And here's what he said, quote, "The United States is owned and dominated today by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families. These families are the living center of the oligarchy which dominates the United States, functioning under a democratic form of government behind which a de facto government, absolutist and plutocratic, has taken form. This de facto government actually is the government of the United States, invisible, shadowy. It's the government of money and a dollar democracy," unquote. Now, as to who these families were in the post-Lincoln era, you could certainly, he names the 60 families, but you're looking at John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, eventually the Warburgs, who joined Jacob Schiff over at Kuhn Loeb. Bernard Baruch and Cleveland Dodge would be some of the major players. And as far as what they did, we talked before about the Spanish-American War. I found that every one of these wars that involved us and has always been multidimensional. So in that war, they first of all, they loaned America, National City Bank, which had representatives from all these interests sitting on its board, loaned America the money to fight the Spanish-American War, which the taxpayers had to repay to them. Yeah. And they also took over the Cuban sugar industry afterwards. They turned our military from a self-defense force into an international police force for the very first time. They destroyed Spain and took over its colonies, calling them possessions. They started the Anglo-American League in 1898, which turned into the Pilgrim Society. That was the beginning of the Anglo-American establishment. And they even destroyed the Populist Party with that war, which had been rising up as a grassroots party against the Republican and Democratic parties, which they controlled. So, but another example, of course, would be World War I, when Woodrow Wilson, who was very much under the control of Wall Street, fought that war, and we got, of course, into the League of Nations, the first attempt at world government, and Americans were built out of billions of dollars, as the post-war Graham Committee of Congress proved, while Americans were dying for $30 a month on the front in World War I. But the other way that they've, of course, was the creation of the Fed in starting with the Jekyll Island meeting in 1910, where they secretly planned it. And as far as how that's harmed America, well, if it's been, I have a graph in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, that shows price levels in America from 1665 to the present, and it's remarkable. But if you look at the first 250 years of American history, there was actually no net inflation. There were certainly times of inflation, like during the War of 1812 and the Civil War, when we printed too much money to pay for the wars. So, but prices would always go back to normal after the wars. But after World War I, the graph just skyrockets, and the dollar's lost about 98% of its value since 1913, and the reason for that was the creation of the Federal Reserve. So that was harmful, and of course it subverted the Constitution, because the Constitution says, Article 1, Section 8, quote, Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, unquote, whereas the Federal Reserve Act, which these bankers created, gave that power to them.
Well, and they certainly have used it in spades, and increasingly so, almost exponentially so right now, which is of grave concern to those of us who believe in free markets. But let me ask you, James, again, the Fed was created, and I believe there were some international interests involved as well. Could you perhaps talk about that?
Certainly. You had the meeting at Jekyll Island in 1910, and the people there represented the basically three major banking houses: the House of Rockefeller, the House of J.P. Morgan, and the House of Rothschild in Europe. And let me just grab a list of who was at that meeting. You had representing the Rockefellers, you had Frank Vanderlip. He'd actually been the guy, Assistant Treasury Secretary, who negotiated a $200 million loan from National City Bank to pay for the Spanish-American War, after which National City Bank made him their president. But he was at Jekyll Island, along with Senator Nelson Aldrich, who is the maternal grandfather of David Rockefeller. His daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., so he was there representing the Rockefeller interest. And then representing the Morgan interest, you had Henry Davison, senior partner in J.P. Morgan and Company, Charles Norton, head of Morgan's First National Bank of New York, and Benjamin Strong, head of Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. But you had Paul Warburg of the Rothschild interest, partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company in New York City, which was the Rothschild banking satellite here, who actually ran that meeting. And those were the interests that not only ran the meeting and planned the Fed, Senator Nelson Aldrich then introduced that as legislation without the Congress or people of America knowing about this secret Jekyll Island meeting, and that ultimately was another bill that got passed, but it's basically the same legislation. But it's quite noteworthy that when the Fed was enacted, the very people who sat at Jekyll Island now ran the Fed. You had Paul Warburg being appointed by Woodrow Wilson to be the first vice chairman of the Fed, and Benjamin Strong, who was at Jekyll Island, was appointed to run the New York Fed. So the very guys who planned this money debauchery system were now given control of it.
You know, it's incredible to me because, of course, the founders of our country, for the most part, I think the early founders, our early government understood the connection and the damage that could be would be, what Lincoln was talking about, the corporate interest, the banking interest, and they very much against a central bank. That was our history. I mean, certainly going back to Thomas Jefferson and later on, of course, President Jackson, and there was a very strong inclination against central banking in the United States. How were these guys able to pull it off? Why were they able to change this very important idea in American history?
Well, typically to engender the changes they want in American policy, they use crises along with controlled opinion through their ownership of the media. And so in this case, it was the Panic of 1907, as I recall, was essentially a deal between the Rockefeller and Morgan interests. J.P. Morgan wanted to get control of the very profitable Tennessee Coal and Iron Company for he was a controlling U.S. Steel, so this was a violation of antitrust law. And he got the Rockefellers cooperation because the Rockefellers wanted to get rid of a company called United Copper, which was threatening their copper interests, namely Anaconda Copper. And so they shorted Anaconda Copper to the point that the stock became worthless and banks were going under who held it as collateral. And J.P. Morgan, who has been pictured as the hero of the Panic of 1907, actually came in. He offered to bail out these banks, provided they hand over all their stock in Tennessee Coal and Iron. And so Teddy Roosevelt looked the other way as this new trust was formed with U.S. Steel taking over Tennessee Coal and Iron while the Rockefellers got rid of their competition. But one of the big banks, Knickerbocker Trust, failed in that Panic of 1907. And I may be wrong about this, Jay, but you know how Wall Street got that big bailout recently, the $700 billion? The Lehman Brothers failed, right? And I have a feeling that Lehman Brothers, they had to sacrifice one bank to make the legislatures and the public think that this bailout had to come. And I think that Knickerbocker Bank was probably sacrificed in the Panic of 1907 to make the public think, goodness, if we don't have a central bank, all the banks are going to go under. But it was a Panic of 1907 that was used as the justification to the public and the Congress that we had to have a central bank.
That's interesting. So this Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, was that was the copper company, or no, which was the copper company?
That was what J.P. Morgan wanted to get hold of, and the Rockefellers were trying to get rid of United Copper, which was threatening their.
Okay, so
they succeeded. They destroyed United Copper,
so they shorted they shorted United Copper, drove the stock price down, so they couldn't fund themselves. Is that what they did?
Yeah, I think they used this tactic a lot. They used it in the Panic of 1929 to the whole stock market, and it seems to me, Jay, they've done this with gold, that they sell the gold short, which causes people to panic, and people who are really long in the market then do sell, fearing that gold will go lower. And they're able to artificially depress prices that way. These guys know psychology. Oh,
they're doing it in spades right now. I can tell you that, James, because this is a focus of my show and discussions I've had with some other people, lots of other people on my radio show. So they're doing that sort of thing, but I find it very interesting. But in any event, so they use these panics or these distress periods of time when we have some real issues to frighten people, and then to get them to hand over power, I guess. And that's essentially the Panic of 1907. Paved the way then for reluctant acceptance of a central bank in the United States, I guess.
That's correct. Crises are the way to create change. Look at the terrorist crises being used to foment Patriot Act and the subversion of civil liberties in a surveillance police state.
Sure. Well, going back through American history, as I say, it was just really something for the central bank to be put into effect, and in effect made us more like other countries, certainly pattern after the Bank of England, I guess. You mentioned at least three major motives for these tycoons, these rich families, to set up the central bank. Perhaps you just go into that a little bit. Stocks and bondage was one of the subtitles in Chapter 3. Talk to us about that.
Well, as I mentioned, after the Fed was created, the men who had secretly planned it were put in charge, with Paul Warburg on the Federal Reserve Board and Benjamin Strong heading the New York Fed. And by running the Federal Reserve Board, they could set the nation's interest rates. And what that meant was that, as you know, when interest rates are going high, I mean, I can remember when Jimmy Carter was president, I had a CD that was paying 8.9% annually. Just amazing. Who wants to invest in stocks when you got a guaranteed 9% return on your money? You know, but so they knew that they could make the stock market go up and down at will by making interest rates go down and up at will, and they now had this control over the direction and flow of the stock market through running interest rates. But in addition to, that was the first one. They actually helped generate the panic of 1929 by almost doubling the discount rate in a span of a few months in 1929. Right,
and then they would also, these insiders would know when interest rates are going to be raised or when they were going to be lowered, so they could front end. They could go in, or front run, I should say, go in and, you know, if interest rates were going up, they could start shorting the market, and if they were going down, they could start buying the market and know what was coming next, essentially. And I wouldn't be surprised some of that's still going on today. But in any event, that was one point. The next one was something from nothing. Well, I guess that's the Fed could print money created out of nothing. You mentioned earlier the tremendous amount of loss of purchasing power of the dollar, 98%, since the Fed went into existence. So that's what you're talking about there, something from nothing?
That's right. The Fed has this remarkable ability to create money from nothing. So if the Congress needs money, an agent from the Treasury can go to the Fed, and a Fed officer can write out a check. If the government needs $1 billion, they can write out a check for $1 billion to buy government bonds that otherwise the government wasn't able to sell. And so they have this ability to create money from nothing. But when you create money from nothing, you increase the money supply, of course, and more about these mechanics than I do, but when you create money from nothing and increase the money supply, the value of the dollar goes down. And that's why, you know, when in 1962, tuition at Harvard was $1,500, I don't know what it is today, $50,000, $60,000. The average cost of a home in 1962 was $12,000.
Yeah.
You could buy a brand new automobile for $1,000 or $2,000. A postage stamp was 4 cents, and a candy bar was a nickel. And we all know this has been happening, but it's been happening because of the increase in the money supply. And by the way, this also gave them, by creating money from nothing, they could create money that would go to multinational corporations, defense contractors, pay for wars without the necessity of raising taxes. And the trick to this is Congress would go along because, you know, if you raise taxes, chances are you might not get reelected. But when you pay for wars and other government projects through inflated dollars from money from nothing, the public pays through higher prices at the supermarket and higher taxes and higher college tuition, and they blame those institutions. They don't realize it's actually the Fed that's doing it by devaluing the dollar, the real culprit.
Right. So it's a silent tax on the American people that the American people don't recognize. It's a sleight of hand by these guys, by these tycoons, by these evildoers, essentially. Really sneaky sort of behavior. It's not unlike a thief going into a house at night when there's no lights around. So what about the third point, soaking the American people? I mean, this seems like that's what you're talking about, perhaps, or is there something else to that point?
Well, yes. I mean, a part of this also was the income tax. You know, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and the income tax was created in 1913. And it's really no coincidence. And both pieces of legislation were introduced by the same man in Congress, Senator Nelson Aldrich, the grandfather of David Rockefeller. And the idea was that you would start generating these government bonds, which the banks could buy up, but you had to have some way of paying back the interest on these bonds, which for the bankers would be tax-free, and of course anybody who wanted to buy them. But to generate the ability for the American government to repay the interest on loans to the government, it was necessary to generate the income tax, which had been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1895, which is why they had to get a amendment to the Constitution to get it across. But when I talk about soaking the American people, I'm talking about the combination of inflation plus taxation, which then what happens is you've got so little earning power between the taxes and the inflation that people are forced to respond to these credit card offers that come in multiple envelopes in the mail every day, and then they start borrowing money themselves to pay for groceries and pay for their rent and become further enslaved to the debt system.
Well, that's certainly what's happened, and I think we've hit up against the wall now. It's really difficult for the American economy to grow anywhere because there's no more room left on the credit cards of the average people in the United States. They have and the real incomes are declining, along with the fact that they've already tapped themselves out on the credit. So banks are not giving people more credit to any great extent now, or there just isn't any room under their cards to use them. We see James, we see these guys from the Federal Reserve. We see all these guys, these Keynesian economists with degrees, PhDs from Princeton, Harvard, and Yale. They talk so well. They're silver-tongued. They look so good. They dress very well, and they sound like such perfect citizens. And however, and they seem to really not want those floodlights to come on when they're breaking into our homes. We see the resistance from former Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke against Ron Paul's suggestion that the Fed should be audited. There was, however, a limited audit that was conducted, thanks largely to Ron Paul. And you point out in your book that there are there's some examples of Federal Reserve corruption that even with this limited audit revealed. Could you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, did do this limited audit on the Fed, and they found that over a 3-year period, 2007 to 2010, the Fed gave $16 trillion in financial assistance to multinational banks and corporations, including some foreign ones, and Citigroup was the largest recipient, $2.5 trillion, not billion, but $2.5 trillion. And Morgan Stanley got $2.04 trillion, and these were technically loans, but they were loans at 0% interest. I think the discount rate is supposed to be 0.75 currently, but they were given a 0% interest loans, and according to the audit, very little had been repaid. We don't know if it will be repaid. And so this was basically just gifts. And wouldn't you like to get free money? But this is the system. It was created by the rich for the rich. And Bernie Sanders, who just declared for presidency recently, a U.S. Senator from Vermont, said, quote, as a result of this audit, we now know that the Federal Reserve provided more than $16 trillion to some of the largest financial institutions and corporations in the United States and throughout the world. This is a clear case of socialism for the rich and rugged, you're on the road individualism for everybody else, unquote.
Yeah, I think he's got that right. I mean, I'm no big fan of Bernie Sanders. He is certainly a socialist, and I don't match up, and I'm sure you don't either, James, with his views of what we should do. But nonetheless, in terms of what is wrong, I think he's hit the nail on the head there. Certainly. Well, let's move on to Chapter 4 of your book, titled "How the Cartel Has Run America." Even before the Federal Reserve was created, these guys they used their wealth and influence to manipulate the political process in America. Specifically, they pulled some strings to ensure their guy Woodrow Wilson would become president. Can you explain a little bit how these players, the people we're talking about, were able to get their choice for president in Woodrow Wilson?
Well, they do it every time. Well, Wilson, he really came out of nowhere. It's very similar to Obama. He had been a professor at Princeton, and a couple of his classmates, Cleveland Dodge, who became associated with National City Bank, and Cyrus McCormick, who started McCormick Harvester, were among the people who sat on the Princeton Board of Trustees, and they made him president. They were actually classmates of his. I think it was the class of 1879. And then they decided that this guy, they would groom him for president, and he wrote a book called The History of the American People. It was published by Harper, which was owned by the Morgan interests. And it was amazing. This guy became president with almost zero political experience. He never served in Congress. His only political experience was 1 year as governor of New Jersey. But to become president, and the source I quote on this is Curtis Dahl, who was he was syndicate manager for Lehman Brothers, and he was also the son-in-law of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And in his book on Franklin D. Roosevelt, he pointed out that Wilson pledged to Bernard Baruch, the banker, he would do 4 things if he was elected president. He would lend an ear to advice on who would occupy his cabinet, which was in fact handpicked by his Wall Street controller, Edward Mandell House, who would lend an ear to advice if war broke out in Europe, and he would support a central bank and an income tax. If you want to look at how swiftly he fulfilled those pledges, income tax and a central bank, the Federal Reserve, were both enacted in 1913. That is his first year in office. He was elected in 1912.
So they really didn't. So they really got the guy that would move very rapidly in the direction they wanted. And I think the book goes into some of the games that were played and to make that happen. It's incredible. And again, this discussion is meant to just let people know about your book and the very interesting titles, the very interesting subjects in there, and also the footnotes, so people can really check it out, because this is really important stuff. This is what we're talking about, I think, is really changing America, and not for the better, unfortunately. So we want to know what's really going on. You mentioned a very important and powerful organization that was created in 1921 that remains extremely powerful today, perhaps more powerful than ever, I would argue, in manipulating the American political process that is, in fact, deciding who we get to vote for, much as these guys did earlier on. But the organization that I'm talking about is the Council on Foreign Relations. It was formed in New York in 1921. And as much as ever, I get the magazine that they put out. I don't even pay for it. It just comes to me. I think somebody wants their ideas to be distributed as widely as possible. But talk to us a little bit about the Council of Foreign Relations. I believe it's a construct of the Rockefellers. Is that right?
Well, David Rockefeller was the chairman for many years of the CFR, and he is still the honorary chairman. It was founded in 1921, as you said, but that date is no coincidence. It was founded as a immediate reaction to the U.S. Senate's rejection of the Versailles Treaty, which would have immersed us in the League of Nations. We have to remember these guys are globalists, and their goal was and remains world government. When the U.S. Senate rejected our entering the League of Nations, the bankers at the Paris Peace Conference held a series of meetings culminating with a dinner at the Majestic Hotel, and they resolved to form a new organization in America to bring us into world government, and that was the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR for short. So if you look at their journal, Foreign Affairs, which you said you're subscribed to, the very first issue had an article called "The Next American Contribution to Civilization," and what's that? Join the League of Nations, right? The second issue said this, quote, "There is going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem of today is that of world government," unquote. That's what they're after. That is their goal. Admiral Chester Ward, a former judge advocate of the U.S. Navy, was a member for 16 years. He resigned in disgust. But here's what he said in 1975. He said, quote, "The Council's objective is submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership. In the entire CFR lexicon, there is no term of revulsion carrying a meaning so deep as America first," unquote. These guys are internationalists.
Yes.
They're the force behind NAFTA. They want NAFTA to follow what happened in Europe. Just as the common market was converted into the European Union, they want NAFTA converted into a North American Union. Robert Pastor of the CFR is considered the father of this North American Union concept. But let me just give you, just to bring it up to date, here's an article from CNN from this year, 2015. It's called "Why We Need a North American Passport." And one of the two co-authors is Daniel Kurtz-Phelan of the CFR. And it says, quote, "In recognition of our shared destiny, the three countries," meaning Canada, Mexico, and America, "should create a North American passport that would, for the first time, allow citizens to travel, work anywhere in North America." And it goes on to say, in the North American context, much like the European Union, our economies and societies are far more integrated. A North American passport would align our laws with reality, unquote. So this goal has never changed. The North American Union, by the way, that's just a regional stepping stone to their ultimate goal of a world government. These guys are patient. They boil the frog.
Right, and I would mention also the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the next step to try to pull Asia in Europe and the United States into one government. And again, the whole aim here is to get rid of sovereign government, to take the rights of the American people away from us and give it to a very small ruling elite. It's just counter to what our revolution was about in 1776. And people need to wake up. It may already be too late, but we have to keep trying. Talk to us a little bit about, we had a couple more minutes here yet, not much more than that. Can you talk to us about the CFR's influence today? I think maybe you touched on it for sure. You just did.
I should mention that the Council on Foreign Relations was the actual creator of the United Nations.
Oh, okay.
It was CFR members calling themselves the Informal Agenda Group in the State Department that created the UN. They drew up the plan and gave it to President Roosevelt. The Council on Foreign Relations also, before the Bretton Woods Conference took place, their Economic and Finance Group drew up the plans for the World Bank and IMF. And I should also mention that the Marshall Plan, which was attributed to General George Marshall in his Harvard commencement speech, 1947, that was also drawn up at the CFR by a study group with David Rockefeller as its secretary, a young David Rockefeller, and they were originally going to call it the Truman Plan and have Truman introduce it, but they figured they might not get Republican support, so General Marshall was chosen to introduce that because they felt that as a general, he would appear to be politically neutral, which was not, but they wanted to get Republican support. But they were the incubator for all these things, the UN, the World Bank, and the Marshall Plan, and said go to Vietnam, and they were the ones who drew up our plans for the Vietnam War.
And the IMF, of course, another institution that they were behind. All right, well, we really have to wrap it up now, but maybe just one more word on last week, in chapters 1 and 2, we talked about these 6 major wars, the last 6 major wars the United States was involved in. Maybe you could help us to understand how the CFR and the banks that the CFR is so much attached to, help us understand how they are leading America into wars and how they're making it possible for this endless wars to take place. If you might just talk to that for a minute before we wrap up today.
Well, we talked a little about the National City Bank and Spanish American. Of course, you go to World War I, you've got J.P. Morgan, who had invested billions in loans to the Allies even before we got started in that war. Well, that was pre-CFR, but World War II, you have the CFR heavily lobbying for involvement before we got into that war. And, of course, in our show on false flags, we discussed the fact that Washington had full foreknowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack, which it did not share with our military commanders. If you go to Vietnam, which of course was began with the false flag Tonkin Gulf incident, which everyone acknowledges today never even took place. But I have a picture in my older book, The Shadows of Power, of President Johnson surrounded by his Vietnam War advisors, and every man in the photograph was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And so the reason that these guys are able to dictate policy is they sit in the cabinets. And I'll give you a quote from the back of my new book, Who's the Lonely Warrior. Quote, since its 1921 founding, what small organization has produced 21 Secretaries of Defense, 19 Treasury Secretaries, 18 Secretaries of State, and 16 CIA Directors, and that is the CFR. It doesn't matter if the president is Republican or Democrat, they still have their people at the cabinet and sub-cabinet levels dictating our policy. And of course, they also run the media. If we had time, Jay, and we'll do this in a future show, we'll run down who owns the corporate media, and we'll show you how not only the founders of the major networks were CFR members, but the major news anchors and the executives today. Shaping public opinion.
Well, that's probably a good place to leave it, because next month we're going to talk about Chapter 5 and 6, Chapter 5 on Vietnam, and Chapter 6, which will discuss the hellish future the Council on Foreign Relations has in mind for us. So taking away our rights, taking away our sovereignty, certainly they are doing a great job of it, and most Americans seem to be asleep at the switch, not at all understanding what is taking place. The frog is indeed being boiled slowly, although I think the heat is turning up more and more rapidly. So we do look forward to our discussion with you next week. Thanks again, James, for joining me again this week.